Hi folks. So this Sansui AU 919 that I did a few months ago malfunctioned, and the owner contacted me and told me that one morning he turned it on and it died. As technicians, we don't like to hear about failures shortly after we've repaired something. I feared for the worst and told him to immediately send it back. I would pay for shipping. He declined that offer and shipped it on his own dime. And when I got it back here, I popped it up on the bench, and the symptoms were identical to the first time I received it. No power. But when I began to look at it, I discovered that the fuse had not blown. So we were dealing with something a little different here. And as it turns out, it was unrelated to the repairs I did before. But it brings up an interesting point, because we're working on vintage audio equipment. And if any of you have owned vintage cars, you would know that even though you've had a complete frame-off restoration done, that car can still leave you on the side of the road. And indeed, this receiver, this integrated amplifier, had gone through a complete rebuild process by a gentleman named Scott, who was a member of an audio forum I belonged to, and he did a stellar job. Excellent parts choice, excellent workmanship. He really went through the whole thing. That said, there are still things that can malfunction. I had to replace the power switch on the last Sansui I did, the AU 11000. It had failed. These things are getting up to 40, sometimes 50 years old, and things are starting to go south. And I'm going to show you what happened to this and how it's unrelated to the problem we had before. Fortunately, this gentleman is very understanding, because most people are suspicious of repair, folks, and it had exhibited the exact same symptoms as it did before. But I'll show you what I found. I'm going to show you some schematics and pictures like we normally do. But first I'm going to pop the cover off and show you where the general area was that the problem occurred. Okay, so if you recall, the original problem we had with this unit is that we had a shorted output transistor down here. So we replaced all the transistors on this channel. It's always a good practice, if you have one shorted transistor or one transistor that fails, to replace all the ones on the affected channel. The reasoning behind this is that when one transistor shorts out, it can stress the ones that are left, and it's just best practice to simply replace them all. If you also recall, I was not able to find any transistors of the frequency, what they call the FT, the transition frequency, anywhere near what the originals were. And in fact, the originals have been changed out for these that had a higher, but still not as high, transition frequency as the originals. I received a PM on the audio forum I belong to from a gentleman named Dennis. That's spelled with one N and two S's. And Dennis is a very, very sharp technician. And he explained to me what I didn't understand, and that is the reason that you need to use so-called fast transistors in the outputs of these amplifiers is so that the feedback will be fast enough to correct any anomalies. And this will prevent what's known as TIM, or transient intermodulation distortion. And that was the whole reason they made these amplifiers with such a ridiculous frequency response. Remember, the frequency response of human hearing is supposed to be between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. And this amplifier goes from DC to, I believe, 500 kilohertz. And that was the reasoning behind that design choice, was to eliminate transient intermodulation distortion by having a very fast amplifier. In any event, our outputs did not short this time. Our problem was down in here. This fuse board, where we replaced the fuse the first time we had a problem, is where the power comes in from the power switch and then leaves the fuse board and goes to the rest of the amplifier. And that is where I found the problem. So I'm going to put a picture up here so you can get a look at the back of this board. So looking at this picture, you can see that there's a wire sticking up through the board, which is, I'm sorry, oh yeah, that is the switched outlet No, I was correct. It comes from the power switch, comes from the switched outlet here, and goes to this red wire. And if you look at this photo I have up there, you'll see that the circuit trace is completely burned away from where this wire went in. I happened to notice it was really floppy when I went to check the fuses, and that's what prompted me to lift the board out. That's when I discovered the problem. So I jumpered from the wire to the fuse socket and fired it up, and I had voltages in parts of the amplifier but not others. There's diodes mounted on this board, and I'll pop the schematic up here so you can see what I'm talking about. And they feed through the other fuse on this board because we have a 10 amp line fuse that comes from the transformer for the whole amplifier, and then we have a 1 amp fuse that goes to the protect module. And what had happened is, if you look at this picture here, you will see that this blue wire that goes to ground is flapping in the breeze. It had pulled out of its solder joint. Now, boards like this generally don't have wires that pull out. At the age of this equipment, we are far from the first ones to be in it. And wires can only be flexed so many times, and they tend to break. This wire didn't break, it pulled out. So it was not soldered well, most likely from the factory, because even during the rebuild process, there was no reason to pull this board. So that was interesting. Once I soldered that back in, normal operation was restored. So that's why this came back. Now, what can we do to avoid things like this? It's tough. Like I said, these units are many years old and were never designed to be in service this long. And even though it's been completely rebuilt, there are a lot of things on here that can and do fail. One thing I do to minimize returns is I test every single function on a unit, and then I keep it for about a week, and I use it every day. Power it up, power cycle it several times a day, turn it up, turn it down, leave it run, leave it on overnight. I try to do everything I can to make sure that something won't come back. And even so, as I said, considering the age of these devices, things can come back. Now, I believe the root cause of the problem we had here was a solder joint that over time had become higher in resistance, and every time you turn this amplifier on, it would stress that point, and it would stress it and stress it, and I believe parts of the circuit pad started to burn away, and when the last vestige burned away, the amplifier would no longer turn on. But anyway, this thing works fine now. I hate to say it, but it's just one of these things that you have to deal with when you're into vintage audio, vintage cars, or pretty much vintage anything. You're going to have to deal with things that break. You can rebuild these things as much as you want, but unless you basically jack them up and drive a new amplifier under it, the chassis is going to stay the same. The switches and pots are going to stay the same because you don't just replace those. And things are going to happen. We do what we can to minimize them, but if you're into the vintage audio thing, this is going to be your life. Things will occur. Anyhow, I just wanted to make a video to talk about this, and thank the gentleman who owns it for being so understanding, because from the user standpoint, the symptoms were identical, but the causes were far different. Okay, folks, so I'm going to end this right here. I just wanted to make a short video. It's been a little while, and I wanted to talk about items that come back. Okay, so that's all I got for today. I've got a few more things that will be popping up on the bench probably later this week, and we'll talk then. As always, I like giving back to the community that's given me so much. Thanks a lot for watching. Take care.